You know, there are moments in history when you witness something so profoundly disturbing that it forces you to stop and reckon with just how far we've fallen. I've spent years analyzing political developments, commenting on the erosion of democratic norms, and warning about the dangers of certain ideological paths. But what I'm about to share with you today represents something I find deeply troubling on a level that goes beyond partisan politics. It's about science, public health, and the fundamental trust that nations place in one another when lives are literally on the line. When a close ally, a neighbor that shares the longest undefended border in the world with us, publicly declares that they can no longer trust American health institutions, we need to sit up and pay attention. This isn't about political point scoring. This is about the very real consequences of decisions being made in Washington right now. I want to take you through a story that broke recently, one that hasn't received nearly the attention it deserves in our domestic media landscape. Canada's Health Minister, Marjorie Michel, gave a year-end interview that should send chills down the spine of anyone who cares about America's standing in the world, and more importantly, anyone who cares about public health. When asked directly whether she could trust United States health institutions as reliable partners, her answer was stark and unequivocal. She said, and I quote, "I cannot trust them as a reliable partner. No." Now let that sink in for a moment. This isn't some adversarial nation. This isn't a government looking for excuses to distance itself from America. This is Canada, our closest ally, our largest trading partner, a country with whom we share not just a border, but deep cultural, economic, and historical ties. And their health minister is saying publicly that the United States can no longer be trusted when it comes to scientific and medical information. I've been watching the transformation of American institutions with growing alarm for years now, but this particular development strikes at something fundamental. For decades, the United States has been the global leader in public health research and epidemiological data collection. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has been the gold standard, the institution that other nations look to for guidance during health crises. The National Institutes of Health has funded groundbreaking research that has saved countless millions of lives around the world. These weren't just American institutions, they were global resources, beacons of scientific integrity that transcended national boundaries. And now, according to one of our closest allies, that's no longer the case. We've squandered something precious, something that took generations to build. Minister Michel was explicit about the reasons for her concern, and they directly trace back to the current administration's policies. She described the issues with misinformation emanating from the United States as a big preoccupation for her government. Think about what that means. The Canadian government isn't just politely disagreeing with some policy positions. They're saying that the information coming out of American health agencies can no longer be considered reliable. They're saying that misinformation, not just from social media or fringe websites, but from the apparatus of the American government itself, has become so pervasive that Canada needs to look elsewhere for trustworthy partners. Michelle specifically said that Canada is now looking to other like-minded countries for the scientific collaboration and information sharing that they used to get from us. We're being replaced, written off as unreliable by our own neighbor. The minister acknowledged something that makes this even more poignant. She said that Canada is used to looking to the United States as a source of health and scientific information, past tense, was used to. That relationship, that automatic assumption that American scientific institutions could be trusted, has been fundamentally altered since the current administration took power. I want to be very clear about something here. This isn't about policy disagreements. Reasonable people can disagree about health policy priorities, about resource allocation, about the best approaches to various public health challenges. What Minister Michel is describing is something different entirely. She's describing a breakdown in the basic trust that scientific information from American institutions is accurate, is unbiased, is driven by evidence rather than ideology. That's a devastating indictment, and it should alarm every American, regardless of their political affiliation. What makes this particularly painful for me to discuss is that I spent years believing in American institutions. I believed in the fundamental strength of our governmental structures in the checks and balances that were supposed to prevent any single administration from doing lasting damage to the credibility of agencies that took decades to build. I've had to revise many of those assumptions over the past several years, and this news from Canada is another painful data point in that reassessment. When I think about the scientists and public health professionals who have dedicated their careers to institutions like the CDC and NIH, people who worked through the AIDS epidemic, through SARS, through Ebola, through the COVID pandemic, it breaks my heart to see their life's work being undermined. These aren't political appointees. These are career professionals who chose to serve the public good, and they're watching helplessly as the institutions they love are being hollowed out and discredited on the international stage. Let me walk you through the specific actions that have brought us to this point, because I think it's important to understand that Minister Michel's assessment didn't come from nowhere. This is the direct result of deliberate policy choices made by the Trump administration, choices that prioritize ideological goals over scientific integrity. The administration has slashed the budgets of both the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the National Institutes of Health. These aren't minor trims around the edges. These are significant cuts to agencies whose core function is to collect and analyze public health data. When you cut the budget of the CDC, you're not just reducing bureaucratic overhead, you're reducing the agency's capacity to track disease outbreaks, to conduct epidemiological research, to maintain the surveillance systems that serve as an early warning network for emerging health threats. You're blinding the nation and indeed the world to dangers that could otherwise be detected and addressed early. The NIH cuts are equally concerning, perhaps even more so when you consider the long-term implications. The National Institutes of Health funds the basic research that leads to medical breakthroughs, often decades down the line. When you cut NIH funding, you're not just affecting this year's research projects. You're affecting the pipeline of scientific discovery that will determine what treatments and cures are available 20 or 30 years from now. You're telling the brightest young scientists that America is no longer a place where their work will be supported and valued. You're driving talent and expertise to other countries that are more than happy to welcome researchers who can no longer find funding here. This is a self-inflicted wound that will take years, perhaps decades, to fully appreciate and even longer to heal. But the budget cuts, as damaging as they are, aren't even the most alarming part of what's happening. What really concerns me, and what I suspect is a major factor in Minister Michel's assessment, is what's happening with vaccine policy. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a man who has spent years promoting anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, is now in a position of significant influence over American health policy. An advisory panel chosen by Kennedy has recently recommended ending routine hepatitis B vaccines for newborns. Let me say that again because I want to make sure you understand the gravity of what I'm telling you. An official advisory panel is recommending that we stop protecting newborn babies from a potentially deadly and chronic disease. Hepatitis B can cause liver cancer, liver cirrhosis, and death. The vaccine has been part of the standard childhood immunization schedule for decades, precisely because it's safe, effective, and prevents enormous suffering. And it doesn't stop there. This advisory panel is reportedly considering changes to the rest of the childhood vaccine schedule. We're talking about vaccines that have eliminated or dramatically reduced diseases that used to kill and disable children by the thousands: measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, pertussis, polio. These aren't abstract medical terms. These are diseases that our grandparents and great-grandparents lived in fear of, diseases that filled hospitals with sick children, diseases that left survivors blind, deaf, paralyzed, or brain damaged. The vaccines that prevent these diseases represent one of the greatest public health achievements in human history, and now their continued use is being questioned by people whose views are not grounded in scientific evidence. This is what happens when you put ideology ahead of expertise, when you staff government positions based on loyalty rather than competence. I want to address something directly because I know some viewers might be thinking it. Some might say that this is simply a matter of different perspectives on vaccine policy. that reasonable people can disagree about these things. But here's the thing, we're not talking about reasonable disagreement based on evidence. The scientific consensus on childhood vaccines is overwhelming. The studies have been done, replicated, and confirmed across multiple countries and decades of research. Vaccines are safe. Vaccines are effective. The diseases they prevent are far more dangerous than any side effects from the vaccines themselves. When an advisory panel starts recommending changes to the vaccine schedule that aren't based on new scientific evidence, but rather on the ideological preferences of political appointees, that's not a difference of opinion. That's the corruption of the scientific process for political ends. And that's exactly why Canada's health minister says she can no longer trust American health institutions. The timing of this Canadian statement is particularly significant when you consider what's happening in Canada right now. Canada is dealing with its own measles outbreak after losing its measles-free status. Think about that for a moment. A country that had successfully eliminated measles through decades of vaccination efforts is now seeing the disease return. This isn't ancient history. This is happening right now in real time in a developed nation with a modern healthcare system. And it's happening because vaccination rates have declined, because misinformation about vaccine safety has eroded public trust, because the same anti-vaccine movement that now has a foothold in the American government has been spreading its message across borders. Canada is watching what's happening in the United States and recognizing that American health policy is now part of the problem rather than part of the solution. What strikes me about Minister Michael's comments is how measured they are, how careful she is being, even while delivering what is essentially a devastating critique of American health institutions. She's not being inflammatory or hyperbolic. She's simply stating a fact that Canada can no longer rely on the United States for trustworthy health information and collaboration. She's saying that Canada needs to find other partners, other countries that share its commitment to evidence-based public health policy. This is Canada building redundancy into their public health infrastructure because they've concluded that America is no longer a reliable node in the network. When your closest ally starts making contingency plans because they can't count on you anymore, that should be a wake-up call. It should force some serious self-reflection about what we've allowed to happen to our institutions. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how we got here, about the chain of decisions and developments that led to a Canadian health minister publicly declaring that American health institutions can no longer be trusted. This didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen because of one bad policy decision or one controversial appointment. It happened because of a systematic erosion of the norms and values that once made American scientific institutions the envy of the world. It happened because a significant portion of our political establishment decided that scientific expertise was something to be mistrusted rather than valued, that public health officials were somehow the enemy rather than dedicated professionals trying to protect us from disease and death. It happened because we allowed conspiracy theories to move from the fringes of the internet into the halls of power. The anti-vaccine movement has been around for decades, but for most of that time it was marginalized, correctly recognized as being out of step with scientific evidence and dangerous to public health. Parents who chose not to vaccinate their children were the exception, not the rule, and they faced social and sometimes legal consequences for their decisions. The medical establishment pushed back against anti-vaccine claims, and mainstream politicians of both parties supported vaccination as a matter of public health, common sense. But something changed over the past decade or so. The anti-vaccine movement found new energy, new platforms, and eventually new political patrons. Social media algorithms amplified misinformation because it generated engagement. Political entrepreneurs recognized that anti-vaccine sentiment could be harvested for political support. And gradually, what had been a fringe position began to move toward the mainstream of one of our major political parties. I want to be very careful here because I think it's important not to oversimplify what's happening. There are legitimate debates to be had about public health policy, about the appropriate role of government in health decisions, about how to balance individual liberty with collective responsibility. I'm not suggesting that anyone who questions any aspect of vaccine policy is acting in bad faith or promoting conspiracy theories. But there's a difference between good faith debate about policy details and what we're seeing now, which is the elevation of people who reject the fundamental scientific consensus on vaccine safety to positions of significant power over American health policy. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. isn't someone with thoughtful critiques of specific vaccine policies. He's someone who has spread demonstrably false claims about vaccines for years. And now he's helping to shape the direction of American public health. The consequences of this shift are already becoming apparent, not just in Canada's loss of trust, but in concrete health outcomes. When vaccination rates decline, diseases that were once under control start to resurge. We're seeing this with measles in Canada, but we're also seeing it in pockets across the United States where vaccination rates have fallen below the threshold needed for herd immunity. These aren't abstract statistics. These are real children getting sick with preventable diseases, some of them suffering permanent complications, some of them dying. And for what? So that politicians can score points with a constituency that has been fed misinformation, so that conspiracy theorists can feel validated. The human cost of this ideological project is being paid by the most vulnerable members of our society, by infants too young to be vaccinated, by immunocompromised individuals who can't be vaccinated, by children whose parents made decisions based on false information. What particularly frustrates me about this situation is how unnecessary it all is. We know how to run effective public health systems. We know how to maintain high vaccination rates while still respecting individual concerns and providing good information to parents. We've done it for decades. The United States once led the world in this area, developing vaccines, demonstrating their effectiveness, and building the public health infrastructure to deliver them to those who needed them. Other countries look to us for guidance, for data, for collaboration, and we've thrown that away, not because of new scientific discoveries or legitimate policy debates, but because of politics, because certain political figures found it advantageous to align themselves with anti-vaccine sentiment, because expertise became something to attack rather than respect, because too many people decided that scientific consensus was just another opinion to be weighed against whatever they read on social media. I keep coming back to Minister Michelle's words because they capture something important about what's been lost. She said that Canada is used to looking to the United States as a source of health and scientific information, past tense. They used to trust us. They don't anymore. And she's not wrong to feel that way, given what's happened. When the president's health secretary is someone who has promoted vaccine misinformation, when advisory panels are recommending changes to the vaccine schedule that aren't based on new evidence, when the budgets of our premier health agencies are being slashed, how could Canada or any other country continue to trust that the information coming from American health institutions is reliable? They'd be foolish to do so. And Canada is not foolish. They're doing what any sensible country would do, which is to look for other partners who still take science seriously. The international implications of this extend far beyond our relationship with Canada, though that relationship alone should matter enormously to us. America's role as a global leader in public health has been built on decades of investment, collaboration, and demonstrated expertise. The CDC has been the institution that other countries' health agencies look to during outbreaks and emergencies. American researchers have led international efforts to combat diseases from HIV to Ebola to COVID-19. This leadership brought tangible benefits to the United States, giving us early warning of emerging threats, access to global surveillance data, and the ability to shape international health policy in ways that served American interests. All of that is now at risk. If we can't be trusted as a partner by Canada, why would other countries continue to share data with us, collaborate on research with us, or follow our lead on health policy? We're isolating ourselves from the global health community at precisely the moment when pandemic threats and antibiotic resistance make international cooperation more important than ever. As I reflect on everything I've shared with you today, I find myself grappling with a profound sense of loss and, I'll be honest, a fair amount of anger. I'm angry because none of this had to happen. The erosion of trust in American health institutions, the damage to our international relationships, the very real risks to public health that are now emerging, all of this is the result of choices made by people who should know better. I've spent years warning about the consequences of putting unqualified ideologues in positions of power, of elevating conspiracy theories to the level of policy debate, of treating expertise as the enemy rather than as a resource. And now we're seeing those consequences play out in the most concrete possible way. Our neighbor, our ally, our friend is publicly saying they can't trust us when it comes to protecting their citizens' health. That's not a political talking point. That's a real world consequence with real world implications. I think about the scientists and public health professionals who have dedicated their lives to institutions like the CDC and NIH. These are people who chose careers in public service because they wanted to help people, because they believed in the mission of protecting and improving public health. They've worked through crises, made personal sacrifices, and built expertise over decades. And now they're watching as political appointees undermine their work, as budgets are slashed, as the credibility they've built is squandered on ideological crusades. Some of them will leave. Some have already left. They'll go to universities, to private industry, to other countries that still value their expertise. And who can blame them? Why would you stay in an institution that's being dismantled, where your professional judgment is overruled by people who reject the scientific consensus you've helped to build? The brain drain from American public health institutions is already happening, and it will have consequences that extend far beyond this administration. What keeps me up at night is thinking about the children who will be harmed by these policies. Every day that goes by without addressing declining vaccination rates, every policy change that makes it harder to maintain herd immunity, every piece of misinformation that goes unchallenged increases the risk that children will contract preventable diseases. Measles isn't just an inconvenient illness that keeps kids home from school for a week. It can cause encephalitis, brain swelling that leads to permanent disability or death. It can cause pneumonia, ear infections that result in hearing loss and complications that affect children for the rest of their lives. And measles is just one disease among many that we've successfully controlled through vaccination. If the childhood vaccine schedule is altered based on ideology rather than evidence, we could see the return of diseases that most American parents have never even had to think about: whooping cough killing infants. Diphtheria, a disease so rare now that most doctors have never seen a case, making a comeback. This isn't fear mongering. This is what happens when vaccination rates fall below critical thresholds. We have historical data. We know what these diseases do when they're allowed to spread unchecked. The situation with hepatitis B vaccination for newborns is particularly egregious because it demonstrates so clearly how ideology is trumping evidence. The hepatitis B vaccine has been given to newborns in the United States since 1991. That's over 30 years of data showing that it's safe and effective. We give it to newborns because hepatitis B can be transmitted from mother to child during birth, and because early vaccination provides the best protection against a virus that can cause chronic infection, liver cancer, and death. The vaccine has prevented countless cases of liver disease and saved thousands of lives. And now an advisory panel is recommending that we stop giving it to newborns, not because of any new evidence of harm, but because it fits with the ideological preferences of the people who appointed them. This is medical malpractice elevated to the level of national policy. It's unconscionable, and it's being done in the name of people who claim to care about protecting children. I want to talk about what this means for America's future role in the world, because I think that dimension of this story deserves more attention than it's getting. The United States has been the dominant force in global health for decades, not just because of our wealth, but because of our scientific expertise and institutional credibility. When the CDC issued guidance, Other countries paid attention. When American researchers published findings, they shaped the global understanding of health issues. When there was a disease outbreak anywhere in the world, American expertise was often at the center of the response. That leadership position brought real benefits, strategic influence, early access to information about emerging threats, the ability to shape international health standards in ways that reflected American values and interests. All of that is now at risk. Is if countries like Canada, our closest ally, can no longer trust American health institutions, why would countries that are less aligned with us continue to defer to American expertise? We're voluntarily surrendering a position of global leadership that took generations to build and that cannot be easily rebuilt once lost. The really painful thing for me is that I can see how this could have been different. Reasonable people can disagree about the size and scope of government health agencies. There are legitimate conversations to be had about regulatory efficiency, about the proper balance between federal and state health authorities, about how to make sure that public health recommendations are based on the best available evidence. You could have an administration that took a more skeptical view of certain public health interventions while still maintaining the fundamental integrity of our scientific institutions. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is the deliberate installation of people who reject scientific consensus into positions where they can shape policy, the slashing of budgets in ways that will degrade institutional capacity for years to come, and the elevation of conspiracy theories to the level of official government consideration. This isn't a policy disagreement. It's an assault on the very idea that scientific evidence should guide health policy. I've been asked by many people what can be done about this situation, and I wish I had an easy answer to give you. The truth is that the damage already done will take years to repair, assuming there's the political will to repair it at all. Scientists who have left public service won't automatically come back. International trust that's been squandered won't be instantly restored. Children who contract preventable diseases in the meantime will carry those consequences with them for the rest of their lives. What I can say is that awareness matters, that speaking up matters, that refusing to normalize what's happening matters. Every person who pushes back against vaccine misinformation, who supports evidence-based health policy, who contacts their elected representatives to express concern about these issues is doing something meaningful. Institutional change happens when enough people demand it, when the political cost of maintaining bad policies exceeds the cost of changing course. That's why I keep talking about these issues, even when it feels like shouting into the void, because silence is complicity, and I refuse to be complicit in the destruction of institutions that have protected public health for generations. Minister Michael's statement should serve as a wake-up call for every American who cares about our country's standing in the world and about the health of our communities. When Canada, of all countries, says they can no longer trust us as a health partner, we've reached a crisis point. This isn't about partisan politics. I know people of good faith on both sides of the political aisle who believe in the importance of vaccination, who trust scientific institutions, who want America to be a leader rather than a cautionary tale. The question is whether those voices can prevail against the forces that are currently driving policy in a dangerous direction. I honestly don't know the answer to that question, and that uncertainty keeps me awake at night. What I do know is that the stakes couldn't be higher, that children's lives are literally on the line, and that the time to sound the alarm is now, before even more damage is done. As I wrap up this discussion, I want to leave you with a thought about what kind of country we want to be. Do we want to be a country that leads the world in scientific research and public health, that serves as a beacon of rational evidence-based policy? Or do we want to be a country that our closest allies view with suspicion, whose health institutions can no longer be trusted, whose children are increasingly vulnerable to diseases that should have been consigned to history? That's the choice we're facing. And it's a choice that's being made right now through the policies of this administration. Minister Michelle has told us clearly how Canada sees us at this moment. The question is whether we're going to prove her right or whether we're going to fight to restore what's being lost. I know where I stand on that question, and I hope you do too. The health of our children, the integrity of our institutions, and our standing in the world all depend on the answer.